Hello, my name is Melissa White, and tonight I'm going to be discussing on how retention of a native language can be achieved through ESL classrooms. For your information, there is going to be a microphone on each page that you may click and listen to this presentation. Before we go into depth on how retention of a native language can be achieved, I want to give you some background. Think of your ESL student. When they first enter the school system, they have no or little English. They don't know very much English. So when they get dumped into the school system, they need to learn English and learn it very, very fast. So therefore, there's an ever-increasing pressure to learn English and to value English more than maybe even their home language or their home culture. This guy named Giso stated that there's an ever-increasing pressure for children these days to value English over their own languages and cultures exerted in politics and in the media, especially when the academic curriculum focused on English only. So this shows that our culture is saying that you need to learn English and learn it now to do well. If you don't know English, then you're not going to do well. So in this paper, we're going to mostly discuss how the rapid learning of a second language without references back to the native language, without meaningful learning, and without conversations to process the information that they are learning, this can cause a bilingual student to lose their first language or simply not maintain it. So the purpose of this paper is the following: to discuss why this can happen, why students can lose their first language or not maintain it. 2, to review unhelpful strategies or simply everyday barriers that ESL learners face. So barriers to retention. And then finally, to overview how teachers can prevent the barriers and strategies to encourage meaningful learning, which goes against the barriers. Let's look at this study done by Montreal. This study was covering monolingual Spanish learners and learners that were ESL learners that learned English as their second language. The study itself focused on verb recognition and usage, and more specifically, unaccusative and unergative verbs. These verbs have determiners that are necessary for comprehension. So the study was focused on this idea. That's whether the second language learners could recognize the articles or determiners that needed to go with the verbs. Ultimately, Montreal defined first language loss, or this is what he was looking for. He says that it's the temporary or permanent loss of language ability as reflected in a speaker's performance or in his or her ability to make a grammatically sound judgments with native speaker monolinguals at the same age and stage of language development. The outcome was this: second language learners and heritage speakers, or students that had picked up another language throughout their time, were less proficient than the native speakers in recognizing these different types of verbs. So because of their second language acquisition and never referring back to the first language acquisition or first language, we can assume that the second language interfered with the native language acquisition. The second reason that learners could lose their first language is because of cognitive forgetting, or because of a lack of subsumption between the first and the second language. Therefore, the information that the ESL learners are getting, they are only processing in the first language. They are never taking time or never being given time to relate it back to their native language and translate it back and learn the vocabulary from their second language. So that means the information from their native language is going to be lost or forgotten because it's never transferred, it's never learned. Just like it happened in the Montreal study, those second language those learners never learned the articles or determiners that went along with their native language. So therefore, we need to have meaningful learning. And meaningful learning that is synthesized. So this means that you're not just creating a great lesson plan. It means that you're allowing time for students to talk, to interact in both in English and in their native language. You're allowing students to translate back to their language and to make sure that the comprehension is full. It's fully there. Because even though we understand all the words that are on the paper, it doesn't mean that the English language learner does. Think about if you ever read advanced calculus, you understand the words that are there, but that doesn't mean you comprehend it. You have to break it back down into simple terms so that you can learn it. This is what a second language or an ESL learner needs to do with their second language. They have to break it down and then bring it back down, break it down even further into the language that they already know and understand well. When a second language learner has the ability to improve his native language and the second language, which would be English, then full comprehension will be attained. There are 4 barriers to meaningful learning. So I'll just read them to you, and then we're going to go deeper into them as we go through the slides. So there is the cognitive load, the language load, the culture load, and the learning load. The barriers to meaningful learning were discussed by Meyer. So the first barrier to meaningful learning is the cognitive load, and that's simply the information that must be processed as the students advances through the grades. Think of difference in science books between 3rd grade and 9th grade, or specifically the difference between birds. Meyer wrote that a 3rd grade reading about the characters of birds contains the biological concepts about the uniqueness of birds' feathers, concepts that are also central to the treatments of birds in a 9th grade biology text. However, the 9th grade text is further loaded, air quote, with specific details about bird anatomy and behavior, and makes much use of scientific vocabulary and technical definitions. So therefore, the topics are the same between 3rd grade and 9th grade, but the detail is completely different. There's a vast amount of vocabulary that goes along with the 9th grade, way more than the 3rd grade. So let's talk about the difference between comprehension, meaningful learning, and language acquisition real quick, and how they're all interrelated. Simply this: if comprehension can't be achieved, meaningful learning is not going to be achieved. And therefore, language acquisition will also not happen because comprehension wasn't there. Ultimately, it's a lose-lose situation. Lose-lose-lose situation, I should say. Second language acquisition is not being achieved, and neither is the first language acquisition, as the material is not being synthesized. This will not cause a learner necessarily to lose his first language, but it's not going to help him retain it either. There's no retention going to be there. The second barrier to meaningful learning is the language load. This is referring to the amount of vocabulary or the number of words. Sometimes students are so overwhelmed by the simple number of words in a passage or the vocabulary or words that they don't know that they can simply abandon hope of constructing sensible meaning out of what has been heard or read, air quote, in English. That quote is from Meyer. Or that the sheer number of unfamiliar words can be intimidating. That makes me sad. It makes my heart cry for students that feel this way. So here are some ways that teachers can combat this, just real quick, to make sure that a student never feels like this. Teachers can break down difficult texts by rewriting them or explaining them. They can also highlight, define, clarify, or again, define academic vocabulary. They can also find similar texts. So similar text refers to finding texts that talk about the same thing, but they're at varying levels. So say a 9th grader is super overwhelmed with a 9th grade science textbook about birds, maybe give them the third grade, and then work it up. Work their way up to the difficult text. Finally, it's important to focus on Vygotsky's zone of practical development, which is the metaphorical distance between a learner's existing developmental state and his or her potential development. You don't want to give a learner a text that is way too difficult and just have them be lost. Break it down, highlight, define, and clarify it. This is working within the learner's zone of practical development, and this is what it will help meaningful learning, or help achieve meaningful learning. The third barrier to meaningful learning is the cultural load. Cultural load simply refers to the different meanings between words between two cultures. For example, think of water. In America, water is an easy access thing. All you have to do is turn on the faucet and ta-da, water. It's great. But that's not the same for any person. Some places it's a precious resource that people have to work for, and they have to work hard for. It means they're going to have to walk a mile, go to a well, pump that water out, and bring it back a mile back. It's not an easy access commodity like we have. So therefore, if you're saying the word water, a person might think water, hard work, whereas we think water, easy to get. So therefore, some words are considered untranslatable just because of their immense differences, such as the word water. To combat this, teachers can give word walls or make word walls to introduce vocabulary and talk about the two differences. Provide dictionaries, because we all know in English that some words have a lot of different meanings. And it's also important to be explicit with expectations and guidelines for group work and group discussions. So this means you say, I expect you today to ask one question and answer somebody else's question. Or I expect you today to listen and you don't have to talk at all. ESL learners need this specificity to do well in the classroom because they simply don't know. The fourth barrier to meaningful learning is the learning load. This is what the teacher expects the students to do with information. Ultimately, teachers should have high but realistic expectations. So therefore, if teachers are asking students that require oral and or written tasks that they're not yet able to do in their native language, then the learning load of the activities is too high. So if they can't do it, so if an ESL learner cannot do this in Spanish or Ukrainian or French, whatever the native language is, they're not going to be able to do it in English. This is the reason that as a teacher, you need to work really hard to support the acquisition of the native language. Just think about the activity brainstorming. Brainstorming is an art activity with fast-paced thinking and few visual cues. This is hard for an ESL learner. Brainstorming should be used as a review activity to where the learners already have the words and vocabulary, not something that's at the beginning and they're stretching and racking their brains to find and remember information that they're talking about. So I've already talked about a few ways to fight each specific barrier, but now I'm going to talk about general ways to increase meaningful learning, which again goes against the barriers to meaningful learning, obviously, and strategies to transfer concepts from English to the native language, which we've already talked about a little bit, but now I'm going to go into more specific details on them. To combat the language load, teachers can also prime students' language pumps by discussing the topic first, using manipulatives, visuals, gestures, actions, direct activities before they ask the students to discuss on the topic. This is the reason that we said brainstorming needs to go at the end. They need ESL learners need their language pumps primed. Furthermore, allow the students to have time to process the material in the native language. This supports retention because they are learning the concepts in their native language, but it also helps you and the student work within their zone of practical development. It gives access to it. Finally, it is really important to allow translations for comprehension, which we have already talked about, so I'm not going to elaborate on that right now. So a way to fight barriers to meaningful learning is by supporting the home language within the classroom. There was a study I saw, and she called her students knowledgeable knights because they were maintaining the culture and advocating for themselves within the classroom. So she encouraged her students to greet each other in lots of languages, hence getting that these ESL learners do have a native language and then they can use it within the classroom, creating that open atmosphere, and also write in their native language too. So there's a quote from this woman, and it says that Kalu, a 7-year-old from Nigeria, was composing a story about a trip to the water park. He wanted to include writing in one of his home languages, Yoruba, but was worried that he didn't know how. So I suggested that he select one word that encapsulated the essence of the story and try to send it out. Kalu combined his literacy in English and his oral fluency in Yoruba to write down an approximation of the word play, yeri, in which he wrote in the box in his drawing. In this, she is allowing the student to use his native language, but to show his comprehension of his trip to the water park. By doing this, you're giving students access to the zone of practical development because you're allowing the native language to be supported and be used as a tool to access English. So another way to fight barriers to meaningful learning is reading books. And there are studies to prove it. Here is a study from Seneca, which they measured the storybook knowledge and found that they're strong predictors of monolingual children's English language skills. Kalia expanded upon Seneca's research with bilingual students, or students learning 2 languages, and she said that there are links to oral language skills and exposure to book reading. So therefore, it's important to read to children in any language, whether it's their native language, it's the second language, or some other random language, because children's language skills will increase. The next way to fight the barriers to meaningful learning is through visual aids. In this study by Xu Ping, it shows that visual aids stimulate understanding. A quote from the study said, utilizing authentic videos is believed to help facilitate and as well stimulate the understanding of both foreign language and culture, because authentic videos help create real-world oriented scenarios in the classroom. So ultimately, teachers can use these to teach nonverbal skills, social skills, and methods to continue a conversation, all of which are important for comprehension, meaningful learning, and relating back, or allowing time to relate back to the native language and making sure this is fully understood. The final way to fight the barrier to meaningful learning is teaching communication strategies, which we just talked about a little bit. Communication strategies include some nonverbal skills that can be used, such as avoidance, which is avoiding a topic, concept, grammatical construction, or phonological element that poses difficulty, or keeping the floor, which is using fillers or hesitation devices to fill pauses and to gain time to think, or basic nonverbal skills, which is like miming, gesturing, reading facial expressions, and using sound imitation. It is important to teach these because students can use them to continue conversations they are having with other people in the class for comprehension. Here's the key. If students can't communicate, then they're not going to process the material. If they're not going to process the material, then your whole lesson is lost. And so is any learning in both the native language and the last language, or the native language and the second language. Well, that's all that I have for you. The next 2 slides will be bibliography pages. So I hope this was helpful for you and give you many application strategies to use within the classroom on how to help retention of a second language, or no, of a first language. Thank you.